The iPhone 14 Pro Max isn't just the most powerful phone around. It's a joy to use thanks to the clever new dynamic island for displaying notification and live activities. Apple's largest Pro model also delivers fantastic cameras including a new 48 megapixel main shooter and always on display compelling action mode for video and obscene battery life. It's pricey, but it's also the best phone money you can buy. The iPhone 14 Pro Max has the upgrades I was waiting for, and one I didn't know I needed. Yeah, the always on display is well overdue, but the biggest upgrade is actually Dynamic Island, delivering alerts and live activities like cue music, turn-by-turn directions, timers, and Face ID animations. It's clever, and I admit it's just fun to use. When I picked up the iPhone 14 Pro Max for the review, I noticed two things immediately. The first is that the notch has been replaced by a P-shaped cutout, and the second is that the camera bump is even bigger. All three camera lenses on the back of the iPhone 14 Pro Max are larger, as is the flash, so this area takes up a lot of room. This is also a slightly heavier and thicker phone than its predecessor. The iPhone 14 Pro Max measures 6.33 by 3.05 by 0.31 inches and weighs 8.47 ounces compared to 6.33 by 3.07 by 0.3 inches and 8.46 ounces for the iPhone 13 Pro Max. There are 4 color options for the iPhone 14 Pro Max: deep purple, silver, gold, and space black. I am partial to the deep purple as it pops the most, and that's the one I tested out for this review. I continue to appreciate the matte glass back and color matched polished steel sides Apple uses for its Pro phones. The overall look is elegant if a bit too familiar, with the same IP68 water resistance. What's missing? That would be the SIM card tray. Like the headphone jack before it, Apple has removed this feature for US models, replacing it with eSIM technology. The good news is that we found it quite easy to add a line to the iPhone 14 Pro Max and you can have 2 active numbers at once. The bad news is that some overseas carriers don't yet support eSIM, so you will need to check if your provider is compatible before you travel overseas. Now this is innovative. Apple didn't just shrink the iPhone's notch and move it down, it found a way to make this area useful and even fun. In addition to housing the true depth camera, the Dynamic Island acts like a mini dashboard providing access to the info you need no matter what app you are in. If you open up Apple Music or Spotify for example and then swipe back to the home screen, you will see the album art displayed on the left side and there's a mini waveform animation on the right. And if you press and hold on the Dynamic Island, a larger window will pop up showing the track progress and playback controls. Or you can press once just to launch into the app. There's a lot of other apps that take advantages of Dynamic Island. You can see the status of your timer there, the next direction to take in maps, the status of incoming and outgoing calls and more. You can even have 2 live activities displayed side by side in the island. Apple is definitely playing catch up with Android phones when it comes to the iPhone 14 Pro's new always-on display, and yet Apple's implementation delivers a more robust experience if you are willing to take the time to set it up. Because the iPhone 14 Pro Max's display refresh rate can scale all the way down to 1 Hz, Apple designed its AOD to essentially mirror the lock screen but at a much lower brightness level, so you can still see your wallpaper lock screen widgets like weather, calendar, and activity ring and notifications coming through. The always-on display is smart enough to turn off if you put the iPhone 14 Pro Max in your pocket or upside down on a table. I personally appreciated having the always-on display for simply displaying the time without having to fully turn on the display, as my dogs usually see that as a sign they can go outside no matter the time to night. In a way, I prefer the simplicity of the Pixel 6 and Galaxy S22 Ultra with their always-on display showing just the basics like time, battery status, and notifications. But I like that there's more customizations option for the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Otherwise, the iPhone 14 Pro Max's Super Retina XDR display is amazingly bright and vivid. In fact, this panel is rated for up to 1600 nits of brightness with HDR content and 2000 nits outdoors in bright sunlight. This panel dazzled as I zoomed in on footage of a fountain as I could make out the drops of water hitting the pool below and creating a fizzy bounce of bubbles. And I got lost in a tropical paradise when playing the Air Twister air shooting game with fluid animations to match the 120Hz ProMotion display. Apple has shaken things up with its camera on the iPhone 14 Pro Max, offering a 48 megapixel wide sensor for the first time. By default, the sensor will group every 4 pixels in a quad pixel and optimize for better light capture in 12 megapixel photos. But you can go 48 megapixel in Pro RAW mode if you want the most detail possible, which is ideal for cropping in. The 48 megapixel camera also enables a new 2x zoom option that joins the 12 megapixel 3x telephoto zoom lens, but you don't get the higher zoom offered by the Galaxy S22 Ultra's 10x dual optical setup. The iPhone 14 Pro Max also features a new 12 megapixel ultra-wide camera that's nearly twice the size, and 12 megapixel true depth camera now offers autofocus along with the faster f1.9 aperture for better low-light photos. In fact, better low-light performance is a big theme across the board with this phone, as there's photonic engine powered by the A16 Bionic chip that's designed to offer brighter and more colorful photos for every camera. You can shoot 48 megapixel photos, but you first have to enable Apple Pro RAW and set the Pro RAW resolution to 48 megapixel in Settings app. It would be easier to initially activate this within the camera app, but once enabled, you can toggle between RAW and normal pics in the camera app. Check out the samples of iPhone 14 Pro Max versus other flagships. The iPhone 14 Pro Max's A16 Bionic is Apple's first chip built using the 4nm process, and it's once again the fastest chip in a phone. The CPU is rated to be only 10% faster than the A15 Bionic, but it offers 50% more memory bandwidth, which aids gameplay. In my testing, I found the iPhone 14 Pro Max wonderfully responsive whether I was bouncing between lots of apps or playing games like Asphalt and Legends. Racing on the Himalayas track, I experienced fluid action even with several other cars on screen jostling for the first place. On Geekbench 5, which measures overall performance, the iPhone 14 Pro Max hits 1882 in single core and 5333 in multi-core. That's notably better than the iPhone 13 Pro Max, which is the 1722 in single core and 4549 in multi-core, and it blows away the Galaxy Z Fold 4 and its Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1 chip, 1328 on single core and 3831 on multi-core. The Galaxy S22 Ultra was even further behind, which is Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 processor, and its single core performance was 1249 and multi-core performance was 3392. Thanks in part to the iPhone 14 Pro Max's more efficient chip, the iPhone 14 Pro Max lasted a very long time on our battery test. We are talking an average of 14 hours and 42 minutes. This is good enough for the iPhone 14 Pro Max to vault near the top our best phone battery life list. The iPhone 14 Pro Max fared quite well in terms of endurance. After charging close to 90% and then using the phone from 1 PM to 6 PM for downloading apps, playing music and shooting photos and videos, the phone's battery only dropped to 60%. Unfortunately, the iPhone 14 Pro Max sticks with 20-watt charging, so there are faster charging phones out there. Charging a drained iPhone 14 Pro Max, we got only 42% in 30 minutes. Apple claims you can hit 50%, so we will be retesting it. By comparison, the Galaxy S22 Ultra got to 58% in 30 minutes with its 25-watt charger, and the OnePlus 10 Pro reached 93% and got to 55% in 15 minutes, benefiting from 65-watt charging speeds. Later this fall, Apple will launch two key safety features for the iPhone 14 Pro Max. The first is Emergency SOS via satellite, which combines new antennas and software to connect to satellites when you can't get a cellular or Wi-Fi signal. You will then get help from emergency services to your location. The second safety feature is crash detection, which leverages the iPhone 14's improved accelerometer and gyroscope to detect whether you are in a car crash, Should a crash happen, your iPhone can automatically dial emergency services as well as notify your emergency contacts you designate. The iPhone 14 Pro Max runs iOS 16 by default, and there's a lot to like in this new software update. You can customize the lock screen with widgets, photos and more, and what you choose will also show up on your always-on display. Other highlights include the ability to unsend texts and edit them, a replacement for passwords called passkeys, and new fitness app, and finally a battery percentage indicator. Later this year, iCloud Shared Photo Library will make it easier to share photos with family members, and live activities are coming from developers, which will make the dynamic island on the iPhone 14 Pro better by showing things like sports score and the real-time progress of your food order or ride share.